Um, so Catherine's book, I have to remember the title, Exchanging Peoples and the Displacement of Population on the Soviet-Polish Border in 1943-1947. So here, published in French a few months ago, terrific book, by the way. That's definitely have to be translated in English for a broader audience. Deals with all displacement of Ukrainian and Polish population on each side of what became the 1945 Soviet-Polish border. Maybe as a first step, because here we focused with Miroslav on one region, Volyn, which is in gray, in the gray area. When you see Lutsk here and Rovno, that's where the 1943 violence against the hundreds of thousands of Polish, mostly rural people, took place. That was the focus of our previous discussion. But Catherine is actually studying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 processes of forcible or population transfer. So maybe we should go one by one, so that people in the audience have the full picture. Volyn has been in the news for anyone interested in Ukrainian studies for quite a bit. The other kind of deportation, Akcja Wisla, on the Polish side, yes, but the 4 or 5 other forcible movements of population, it's far less known. And is it possible to have a pointer? And how do I do that with the light? The top? The top? Sorry? Top of the wheel. Ah, okay. So, all right. So that's Volyn. Okay. So a second area in on the Ukrainian side is Galicia. Right? Can you tell us a few words about the forcible transfer here of population?
I think it would be more interesting to start with the two regions, the two sides of the northern new border of Polish-Soviet territory. It means Volhynia and the region of Helm till Zamość, all this region. Because if you are referring to the precedent discussion about the Ukrainian Polish were in Volhynia and during all that time, what can I see? What can I add to the discussion? I am working on population transfer from 1944, and the first thing we can see is the traces of what happened before in the way the people receive this proposition with this proposition to move. And what you see very much is that from the two sides of the border in these northern territories of Ukraine and Poland, so the Zamość, Chromshina region from one side, and the Volhynia people wanted very much to go. And it asked some question about the linked story of 1943 in all those territories. And I think that in the contrary to what did Miroslav, talking about the necessity to nuance the history of the Ukrainian movement, the Ukrainian resistance movement, I think it is also very important to have a broader view of this war within the big war. And what you see in 1943, you see that for the Poles, it was a totally black year. It was a very tragic year from the both sides of the borders, of the 1944-1945 border, which was, at that time, it was no more a border. it was all this region under German occupation, but on the two sides of the Bug, the western side in the region of Zamość and the Volhynia were for the Poles just a nightmare. And in the Western territory, why? Because the German, after the Reinhard action, so the history of the destruction of the Jews in that region, in the borderlands of Poland, started immediately after, at the beginning of 1943, the so-called General Ostplan, which means to expel in all this Zamość region, expel the Poles in order to start the implementation of the Volksdeutsche and to start to Germanize this territory.
Okay, so is it working? So, Catherine, where's my light here? All right.
Can I finish with that?
No,
Yeah.
let's do it dynamically, okay?
Okay.
Because if not, we'll never make it. You have too much ground to cover. So here she's referring here to an ethnically an area with Poles and Ukrainians, and referred to as Holmshina, and Helm, near Lublin and Zamość. And then she's referring in 1943 to already a third process of internal displacement or external displacement, forced migration, that is Nazi Germany seeking to move German settlers to replace Polish settlers that would then be expelled. So that's the context in 1943. While there is violence on the Ukrainian side, that's the context.
And the context of the Holocaust, right? Aktion Reinhard taking place in that particular area as well. So
Yeah.
all of this happening at the same time, same place.
So, Catherine, what did it do to the Ukrainian-Polish conflict?
So I think it was a very stark signal for the Ukrainian in Volhynia. The signal that indeed the interlinking of Poles already began from the other side and gave an opportunity to do it in Volhynia.
So the Germans were cleansing the Poles on the other side of the border. That gave a signal in terms of technology of violence that we could do the same to the Poles on the Volhynian side of the border. But what did it do internally in Holmshina between the two communities, Ukrainians and Poles?
You mean in 1943?
Yeah, from 43.
From 43, it's a very complicated story because when Poles started to leave, indeed, Volhynia, they arrived in the region of the Holmshina, and from there it happened to them very different things. A part of them were sent directly to Majdanek. A part of them were deported to Germany, and part of them could stay more or less in the borderlands region, more to the south in the region of Przemysl.
But you argue in the book that it actually, the ethnic animosity between Ukrainians and Poles exploded. Why?
Well, it exploded because first the German in the region of Zamość used the Ukrainian in order to expel the Poles, which is a very traditional technique. And this is one of the reasons it explodes on the western part of the territories, which the western side of the border, and it explodes really in 1944 when the German left the territories, and during the time when the Soviets started to arrive, the Poles were already attacking in mass the Ukrainian in the Holmshina and in all the territories of the Lublin region.
But why would the Poles attack the Ukrainians if it's the Germans who deported the Poles?
Because the Germans used also Ukrainian in order to expel the Poles, and also gave the Ukrainian gave part of the Polish exploitation to the Ukrainian because they wanted to build
the lands.
yes
Yeah, okay.
the lands because they wanted to build a sort of what they called a wall a zone of defense around the German farms. And they thought that with using the Ukrainian between the Poles and the German, it would be a kind of wall of protection for the Germans.
So when the Germans leave in 44, basically you have a civil war then between Poles and Ukrainians, and here you have the Polish organized resistance attacking Ukrainian civilians for, should we say, pretty much the same reason as in 43, they have to leave.
Yes.
So we attack them and they're going to leave. And that's a second movement of population here, if it's on the other side. How successful in terms of totality was it?
You know, it's very difficult to have a general bilan because this history of population transfer is you can write this history only with different sequences. Some of them were successful or appeared at first glance to be successful and then not so much. And some of them were a pure tragedy. And the first sequences, which was the displacement of the Poles from the Volhynia regions and the displacement of the Ukrainian from the region of Lublin, appear to be very successful, especially for the Ukrainians who wanted very much to leave the territory of Blud and to go to central Ukraine.
Central Ukraine, not Western Ukraine.
No.
So they didn't go to these areas. Why not?
Why not? Because the Ukrainian team at that time did a plan for relocation, and for them, the most important was to rebuild the collective farms of central and eastern Ukraine. And this region of eastern Poland was for the Ukrainian minority of this part of Poland was of small farmers having some animals, horses and cows, and for the Ukrainians it was the most important was, of course they need labor forces, but the most important were the animals and the tools in order to rebuild the agriculture of Ukraine. So to sum up for the Ukrainian team, it was not only population displacement, but it was an economical transfer.
Now, we've been talking about Volyn here and on the Lublin or Holm region, right? But most Ukrainians on the Polish side, again, it's post-war borders, of the border, lived not near Lublin, but in a region by the San River that you sometimes refer to as Zakarzona. The Curzon line goes back to First World War. There was a British official who basically proposed how, you know, there would be now, because of a new state of Poland, what would be the demarcation line. Although sometimes Zakarzona includes also Holm, but the basic point here is that in your book, what we learn is that they're two different regions. And also the displacements of population happen at different times, even for different reasons and differently even in means. So what can you say about then the displacement of population in the San region? So below Zamość here, with the San, the urban center being Przemysl.
Yes.
And we're talking, I think, at least 500,000
yes.
Ukrainians
it
living
was
in
the official number. Then you can see that the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs, proposed other number and less than 500,000 people. But yes, what you see in the region of the San is that they started to prepare the population to move in later than in the first territories. So they start in the spring of 1945, and they encounter immediately a big resistance in this region. And what you see through the Soviet eyes of these agents who were responsible to this organization of displacement, is for them it was obvious that they were in front of another population, which they're called Galician, and from there they were foreigners, because on the northern part it was also the ancient Russian Empire, and in the south part of these territories there were never Russian there. It was a part of the Austrian Empire, and the traces, the legacy of this history was very obvious for the Soviets. So they encountered immediate resistance. In the summer of 1944, almost no people left the territory, except in the Lemko region. The very eastern part of the Lemko population was these enthusiastic of the southeastern region who were.
We'll need to speed it up a bit, but essentially we're talking here, so contrary to Lublin, I hate that. When you see there's basically in Volyn after the violence, or due to the violence, and in Holmshina due to the violence, people wanted to leave. Ukrainians, Poles wanted to leave. You get to San, half a million people, they don't want to leave, mostly, and then there's organized resistance by the OUN in particular. The outcome is they left, but then the Polish army was used, but in two installments. The second installment being the event that is fairly well known in Ukrainian historical memory, Aksia Wisla, but that's 140,000. Most Ukrainians who were deported by the army moved to Ukraine before Aksia Wisla, even a couple of years before, right?
So you want me to speak about Aksia Wisla?
I'm going to intervene, actually.
Yeah.
I think that you should speak about the Lemkos, because I think one of the great strengths of this book is that actually the category of Polish and the category of Ukrainian are very complicated, right? Like you've just pointed out, to be Ukrainian in Volhynia was different than to be Ukrainian in Galicia. And the way that people responded to people supposedly of the same ethnicity was very different depending on their region, right? And that we're very much talking about, again, very different identities. And I think one of the groups that you really bring out throughout the book is the Lemkos, right? And for the Poles, they're Ukrainian. For the Ukrainians, they're Polish, right? And I think the story of the Lemkos is one of the untold stories that you bring out in the book. Can you tell us briefly about the Lemkos?
The problem will be briefly, because
It has to be brief.
it has to be brief. Okay, so I would like to show you, but unfortunately it will be too difficult to show you the region of the Lemko. It's it's west to the southeastern borderland of Poland, and it goes through the border together with Slovakia.
Around here?
But on the other side, between Przemysl and Krakow.
Oh, here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's the Lemko.
So it's a people of mountains, and as I said, this population was under Austrian Empire before the First World War. And during the interwar period, there were a lot of studies about the Lemkos, which appear to be a population from some ethnographer according to their language, from other according to this position between Poland and Czechoslovakia and so on. I will not here explain you. So what are the Lemkos? They pretended themselves to be an autochthone people. Indigenous, excuse me. Indigenous people, and this was their revendication during this population transfer. But it means to get the right to stay in the region because there were people of the region. There were not Polish and not Ukrainian, just Lemko.
But they lost their battle.
Yes.
So they were deported.
So
as Ukrainians, quote unquote.
yes, they were deported. So approximately 1 year after the end of all this operation of population transfer between Poland and Ukraine. And here I have what I saw is totally different than what it was usually said about the sense of this late deportation, because Wiatrowicz, we just mentioned, Wiatrowicz, for instance, for him, it was clear that it was again inside this game of this terrible conflict between Ukrainian and Poles, and it was again the revenge of the Poles against the Ukrainians. And, but I think if you want to understand what happened really in 1947, you have to see what happened on the two borders on the two sides of the new borders. I mean, you have to see also what happened in Ukraine, what happened with all these people, these Ukrainians, who mostly in the spring of 1946 were expelled already by the Polish army, by the way, who were expelled to Ukraine, to Western Ukraine, in a so they just arrived there without any kind of welcome. They were
expelled to central Ukraine.
At the beginning, but already from the summer of 1945, it was no more. This experience was totally unsuccessful, and so the Ukrainian team decided no more to replace these people in central Ukraine. So from the summer of 1945, there was no more plan for relocation of Ukrainian of Poland.
So they were moved to Western Ukraine.
They were moved to Western Ukraine. They were expelled by the Polish army just on the other side of the borders. And these populations, this expelled population, started to take the empty house the Poles just left behind them. And you have to, we have to remind that at that time, one of the most important problem for Ukraine was household, was the lack of house. And so why I mentioned that? Because you had a very contradictory situation between this population arriving in Western Ukraine and trying to find a house to live, and the Soviet and the implementation of the Soviet regime borders.
Okay, we'll move to the question period. Just to conclude the geographical sweep, since you cover so much territory. So here we have, as Catherine told us, nearly 500,000 Ukrainians that are deported by the Polish army to Ukraine, and by that time it's mostly to Western Ukraine. But then you've got 500,000 Poles that are displaced. They want to leave by that time, according to your evidence, but they're displaced to the areas that are now depopulated because of forced migration of Germans in the newly conquered territory, a newly annexed territory of what is now post-war Poland. So the Poles here end up here in formerly German households. The Ukrainians here end up here, or seek to, in former Polish household. And the Germans, well, they moved to Germany. Now let's ask a few questions. Mayhill.
Okay, so I have a couple questions, but I'll just ask one to start. Another strength of the book, I think, is that you clarify who does what to whom, right? You clarify who is expelling, who is deporting, right? The Ukrainian team, the Polish team, right? The Lublin Poles, right? Who is actually planning these incredible movements of people, and how are they carried out, right? I mean, I think this is one of the strengths of the book. And one thing that comes out is the strange quality of the Soviet policy, that on the one hand, they're successful in that they move people, but you talk about how there's actually a lack of systematization, that in fact there's an ad hoc nature to it. And I wonder if that tells us something larger about the Soviet regime in this period.
Thank you for this very good question. Indeed, I think it's a very specific time because we are used, when we are talking about Soviet history, we are used to see what happened, what the center decided to do, and how it was applied then. And here we are in a very specific time where the Stalinist team delegated all this operation of population transfer to the Republican level. And you see that very, very well first because you have almost no evidence in Moscow about all these operations. But the most important is to see how different it was, where the scenarios between Ukraine and Eastern Poland, but also in Lithuania or Belarus. And I think the best example is Lithuania, where Poles were all was done in order not to let the Poles leaving the territories. So it's the history is totally the contrary of what happened in Ukraine, where the Poles were almost expelled from these territories. And by the way, this is the reason why it is so difficult for the Poles today to construct a coherent memory and a picture of this history because of these two extremes between expulsion from one side and the sense of captivity for those who had to remain in Lithuania.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually another really important point, that the historical memory of what you talk about in the book is radically different, right, in different places, and that there's space to remember this. For example, in Wrocław, right, for Poles who came to Wrocław, right, after 1945. But there isn't space for sort of this remembrance of this event in Ukraine today, right? And so that kind of difference in historical memory, I think, is another thing that comes out of your book, right?
Yes, I think, there is a very long tradition in the Polish society that everyone is responsible for the historical memory of the country. And you see that from the 19th century, all this tradition of writing memoirs, or all this kind of testimonies. And in Ukraine, you don't have such a tradition. And it's, of course, when you are working on these two peoples, it's finally very difficult because you have a lot of testimony from the Polish side and almost nothing silence from the Ukrainian ones. So this is a difficult
Yeah,
task.
I was very struck in one moment in the book you say that there's no, that you cannot have a common narrative,